The day, Friday, October 13th, 1927. 17-year-old Timmy Smith is out looking for some fun on the streets of Minneapolis when suddenly he finds out that something, or better yet, someone, is out looking for him too.
The screams were just horrifying. I knew without a doubt someone wouldn't be walking up the streets that night.
Tall, muscular man, all black.
It was a time when the stakes were high. On one hand, you had the prohibitionists working with the law to stop the spread of illegal alcohol, but on the other, bootleggers taking advantage of those so desperate they were willing to pay high prices for a single serving.
And pay they did. I'm not talking about the common man. I'm either these kingpins, they dominated the underground alcohol trade and were racking up power and money. And we were all scared for our own safety. Bribe seems like an easy way out. And the more we caved in, the more we got offered, the more we were willing to turn our heads the other way. Only within the past few decades we were able to stay strong in our resistance to bribery and diligence to the law. Back then, molesters, some of America's most prominent gangsters, were organizing and corrupting not only us, but public officials and bankers, as well as to execute their ill-cited agendas.
In this day and age, it might be hard to conceptualize, but the 1920s social landscape was a completely different world than we know of today. I mean, I've met with clients who've been manipulated to drug usage, corruption, and gang membership, but back then it was commonplace. And instead of fighting against it, many instead found themselves intertwined in the shifts in 1920s America.
We, the true American people, are gathered here today to defend not only ourselves, but our great nation from the beast that has been unleashed, who has escaped from the cage of the 18th Amendment and continues to expand its grip across our great homeland, corrupting our legal system and tainting our pure heritage. Alcoholism would be frowned upon by our forefathers. Why then should we let it continue to manifest in America? We've come far in defending our heritage from the vile grasp of intoxicating liquors, so we let our work in the 18th Amendment pass us by. We've formerly seen the end of the illegal alcohol transportation, manufacture, and sale exchanges. But what about its usage? Are we to stand by and watch as its bootleggers foster its growth and continue to degrade our already declining society?
Even before I was presented with evidence, I had a feeling Mr. Smith's case was heavily intertwined with great divisions presented by the 1920s. He had behind him a rebellious ancestry and a fundamentalist upbringing, a religious family that had fully supported temperance, and an era of prohibition these movements would have given rise to. Yet was a product of progressive era. Most wealthier members of society would have had the means necessary to acquire illegal alcohol, and his father's funds were no exception. Coupled that with rising influence of stars and their physique flapper styles, and sure enough, he could have very well been corrupted into becoming affiliated with gang memberships.
You know, I knew Timmy. He was a charming young man, really, but so defiant. Growing up in Minneapolis, he often found himself on the streets, his mind being corrupted by the immoral scenes he faced. By 15, I already knew he was falling to alcoholism. Between the flap of feathers I sometimes found on his jacket, and the heavily confused and dazed young man that walked into my household.
He came home many nights reeking of liquor. He had made a few friends he hardly spoke of, but from the few times I saw them, I could tell they weren't like us. Hardened and brazen, they were everything an American wasn't. Immigrant gang members, perhaps. I just hadn't realized at the time.
As it would turn out, the friends that Timmy had often been seen with were not, in fact, his comrades, but affiliates of a local boss who was heavily interested in Timmy's changing mentality, popularity, and potential to spread positive feelings of alcohol unto his peers. Discovered via a confession of one man, Luigi Aranto, 20 years after the murder, though he failed to acknowledge just who he was affiliated with. During the era of Prohibition, domestic sales for alcohol plummeted. With liquor in short supply, prices quickly skyrocketed, and with it, risks. Those wealthy enough to buy smuggled liquor would have been able to bribe and coerce, and so I wouldn't be surprised if Timmy's father had something to do with his gang affiliations. Before long, our modern-age forensics team begins to inquire on Mr. James Q. Smith's background as to whether or not authorities at the time overlooked his potential as a suspect. Relatively quickly, we found records of Mr. Smith's heavy involvement in local politics. It appears as though his role as a minister did not emerge until later in his life upon his second marriage. By this point, Timmy would have already been 10 years old, so any experiences he would have had with his father would have already been ingrained in his mind.
My team and I soon found out that Mr. Smith Sr. had a criminal background prior to World War I. Though these counts were largely business related, coming as we may describe it today, his father had ties with Jay Gold, a notorious con man during the Grant administration, though we've never seemed to undertake a task of his caliber. Instead of bribing on a frequent basis, he appeared to only bribe others in desperate instances, often taking them instead for the benefit of his own social status.
Even if his actions weren't directly related to murder, Mr. Smith would have held the know-how of manipulation, something commonplace in the illegal alcohol trade of the 1920s. With the enactment of the 18th Amendment, which made it illegal for Americans to buy, sell, manufacture, or transport alcohol, and the subsequent passing of the Volstead Act, which provided the legal basis for such legislation, a new opening was made for criminals to make high profits, and many formerly corrupt officials soon toured the practice as well.
You know, it's actually during this period where we see the origins of organized crime really being laid. Millions of Americans, knowingly or unknowingly, may have contributed to the vast networks that dominated America's underground society at the time. In rural areas, moonshiners, which were often everyday men, processed grain into liquor. Big cities house clubs and speakeasies that offered illegal alcohol and entertainment, customer satisfaction. With time, these two distinct industries would contribute to widespread underground alcoholism, bringing in substantial funds that would force these bootleggers to organize, allowing many to soon pursue an international agenda.
Early on, attempts were made to confront activities which were referred to as rum running and bootlegging. These illegal methods of alcohol transportation and delivery heavily contrasted with America's mainstream economic trajectory and gathered opposition from many Americans who held that family stability, improved morals, and crime prevention in high esteem, and directed their cultural concerns toward urban immigrants and the ethnic culture of saloons. With time, these efforts would prove ineffective as a crusade against liquor. Within a short matter of time, alcohol kingdoms would flourish, allowing some of our nation's most notorious criminals to take the stage.
At the time, we see the motivations for the rise of the reformed FBI becoming increasingly evident. Federal raids and destruction, led by the Treasury Agency, often rendered ineffective, allowing the illegal liquor trade to continue to flourish and bringing many men to act more and more brazenly, with murder becoming a common means of installing influence and fear across their dominance.
During the 1920s, forensic science was in no way as developed as it is today. Even over the past few decades, major strides have been made in the field to bring justice. Transportation at the time existed, though it was not as efficient as we see it today. As a result, few people considered the era's leading criminals as prime suspects for events taking place outside of their known areas of activity.
Was this the fatal flaw in examining the many murders of the Roaring Twenties? Detective investigator Diane Shutna weighs in.
Records show that Mr. Timothy Smith had lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota his entire life. Though his family was quite wealthy, we found no travel records of either himself or Mr. James Smith outside of 30 miles of the city. If his father had committed the murder, it would have been fairly obvious. Minneapolis was not as renowned for its killing as other major cities, like New York and Chicago, and so the press would have been able to conduct detailed investigations into the event.
We also have reports that by the end of the 1920s and the era of Prohibition, Mr. Smith began to look toward restarting his life and career. Witnesses from the time have claimed to see him wallowing in despair and attempting to reconcile with his family and God, undergoing a complete transformation that would ultimately lead to his marriage to Jane Smith in 1928. Given Mr. Smith's psychological alibi that began in 1926, an entire year before Timothy was murdered, investigators began to search for a new prime suspect in the murder. As the era of Prohibition progressed, so too did the desperation to bend the law. Desperation and high demand spurred high prices for illegal alcohol, leading to booming business opportunities for bootlegging. Following the enactment of the 18th Amendment, we see shifts in gang structures from small-scale bands of thugs to organized networks and leaderships from political bosses to mobsters, some of the era's most dominant gangsters. political machines and gangs continue connectivity, leading to an interconnected system through which gangs intimidated candidates by running against affiliated bosses and turn votes in their favor. In return, bosses worked with police to ignore illegal alcohol, gambling, and prostitution, creating ties with public officials that would allow mobster influence to expand into the 1920s. Leading criminologist duo Elizabeth Jeffries and Dan Thomas explain this major shift in crime structure.
I mean, yes, Prohibition was most certainly a major catalyst in changes in mob structure, initiating the emergence of the organized crime systems we're familiar with today.
Early on, we found that many criminals, which at this point were still largely local bands of thugs, lacked knowledge on business, instead using violence to intimidate competing bootleggers and a potentially suspicious public.
This can be best seen through criminal activity involving the armed protection of breweries and alcohol transportation systems that included the emerging rum-running practice against the public eye and rivals, and the bribery of officials to look past these illegal actions.
Later on, high demand in payments to and from bosses and police began to pile up, leading to a dire need for organization. As funds continued to pour in and actions became more advanced and widespread, lawyers and accountants began to be relied upon to defend mobsters' actions and oversee the heavy funds pouring in.
With time, rivalries would begin to get overshadowed to combat busting, which would lead to partnerships east with outside gangs, real estate investment companies, and shipping services.
With these changes, we see a pivotal transition in American criminals by the turn of the decade. Thugs to businessmen, or as we more recognize it today, the rise of organized crime. With Mr. Smith Sr. out of the picture, it begins to become apparent that perhaps more parties were involved in the murder of Timothy Smith than had ever been previously thought.
By the mid to late 1920s, we see vast underground networks of gangs, or as we were becoming increasingly referred to as mobs and mafias.
Though racial and ethnic tensions were high during the Roaring Twenties, and were certainly obvious in some instances, including the Irish, Polish, and Italian mafias, many gangsters soon found themselves coming together to serve a common underground goal: profit.
By the time Mr. Smith was dead, and even before that, kingpins had already grew and were set in motion, with popular support from speakeasies, alcohol-deprived public, political bosses, gangsters, and bribed officials. These prominent criminals and gang leaders would eventually become essential to the success of all of these operations.
With the rise of kingpins, the foundations of a very vicious cycle were laid. As the records have established, the era of Prohibition led to a staggering demand for alcohol, and as such, substantial bootlegging operations gained steam, whereby heavy funds were delivered out of desperate hands for a very risky practice. With time, kingpins would be able to each pull approximately $100 million annually, making them able to afford heavy bribes to politicians, police, and investigators that would allow this pattern to continue unnoticed. But just who were some of these kingpins, and could they potentially be involved in the murder of Mr. Smith?
With the rise of organized crime came some of history's most notorious criminals, many of which would become kingpins during the era of Prohibition. Perhaps most notably, Chicago's Al Capone, remembered for his organization of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Al Capone, a ruthless and tactical American mobster, could he be to blame for a crime that occurred hundreds of miles away?
Stakes continued to climb. Rivalries for domination for illegal liquor industry rose. Increasing prices of alcohol manifested themselves. The means of violence, which by this point incorporated complex networks of hitmen, scouts, armed guards, which all became more intense.
Loyalty and domination were certain key factors in the extent to which violence could be seen in American underground. Al Capone was no exception, and today he embodies the sporadic, yet clearly throughout styles used that wreaked havoc on the American public. Prior to Capone assuming leadership, boss Johnny Torrio strove to keep peace between Southside Italians and Northside Polish and Jewish gang members.
However, after Al Capone assumes leadership, relations turned deadly.
What would eventually unfold after heavy escalation of tension is what we would today call a turf war. Capon Street Valentine's Day Massacre was one of the first to occur in American history.
And it would be during this turf war that followers of Al Capone, disguised as police officers, shot and killed 7 rival gang members. This event made Capone's presence even more known across the nation, and his influence could be seen across America.
Al Capone and many other leading gangsters of the time were known to instill fear across the nation. Their reaches as bootleggers stretched far beyond their epicenters. Because of this, it's plausible that Capone may have been involved in Timmy's murder.
As much as I loved Timmy, he wasn't the most diligent individual. He wasn't always the most trustable when it came to outstanding debts.
The high value of alcohol and all the money it would bring into the gangster's circle would have been heavily enforced. Anyone who slipped behind in payments or was considered to be conning some of the men's most powerful underworld would have certainly faced consequences. But was Capone involved? A further investigation was conducted by historian Sarah Sherry to test our thesis. During the era of Prohibition, robberies also spiked dramatically, and most were associated with gang incentives. As distillers and jobs in the liquor industry were shut down and funds began to dwindle toward the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the Great Depression, many became desperate for money to both support their families and their insatiable thirst for alcohol and power. Illinois stood at the center of this movement for a time. As robberies spiked and billions of dollars were robbed in a single year, citizens became armed and trained to defend themselves, their property, and finances.
Though many would have been armed, there wouldn't have been no motive for anyone to shoot a random passerby, particularly if they did not appear suspicious or approach them for crime-related activity.
During this period, we also see a rise in auto theft, which would immediately be calmed by the Dreyer Act, though the most brazen-minded would continue in the practice, even amidst major developments in the FBI and security measures.
One such incident, which revolved around uninsured and therefore unvaluable funds to bankers, occurred in 1925. The Fowler Bank robbery revolved around two armed robbers who stole thousands of dollars and escaped in a stolen vehicle. Was this the inspiration for the stealthy murder of Timothy Smith?
Both Quincy, Illinois, and Chicago were close enough to Minneapolis that the killer could easily transport the body to a more inconspicuous location in a single night, but they didn't.
It took investigators another 5 years to make another lead. It just came to me. Criminals were becoming organized. The FBI was evolving. Maybe, in a final strike against the law, more than one gangster came together. It would be a final diversion against the police that would throw them off their tracks following a distinguished, isolated criminals. During the 1920s, the FBI underwent a paradigm shift under J. Edgar Hoover that brought about many major improvements that would have made it increasingly difficult for slipshod criminals to continue in their agendas. Though initially inefficient, the Bureau of Investigation would undergo major reforms. Hoover strove to fire the incompetent and the political hacks, established a strict code of conduct for agents, instituted regular inspections of the headquarters and field operations, insisted on performing background checks, interviews, and physical tests for all special agent applicants, insisted on formal training for programs, and strongly advised young men with backgrounds in law or accounting to consider applying. By this point, substantial funds led to money laundering, which, when coupled with an ever-evolving resistance, forced criminals to continue to develop organizations. Toward the end of the decade and the height of the underground alcohol trade, funds began to be largely funneled into networked casinos, hotels, and foreign accomplices. Though there were some successes, including underworld accountant Meyer Lansky, who established relationships with the Nevada gambling industry and sent funds to Switzerland brokers to cover influence abroad and spur reinvestment, Al Capone, one of our prime suspects, would ultimately prove to be not as financially organized, failing to adapt to a growing presence of the FBI and being charged with tax evasion and facing criminal charges and jail time. If Capone had the MO of Timmy's organized murder, was someone else responsible for the actual death of Mr. Smith? Was their getaway more involved than we had previously thought? Investigator Lyle Anderson explains. Recently, police have discovered that crimes involving two or more parties often involve systematic planning revolving around specific areas or fields of expertise.
Though it was difficult to find untainted DNA on nearly a 100-year-old body, we did manage to find a piece of badly torn and stained cloth that descendants of Mr. Smith identified as belonging to him.
I've seen countless photos of my great-grandfather. As soon as I was presented with the cloth, I knew it lied just below the patterned pocket of Timothy's favorite overcoat.
But just who worked with Al Capone and was willing to take the life of 17-year-old Timothy Smith?
The piece of clothing wasn't the only evidence we found. Within its fibers led a strand of brown hair with a root attached, which still contained fragments of DNA, which we found to match primitive information about Richard Loeb, infamous killer of another adolescent just 3 years later.
It was a shocking revelation. How did Richard Loeb, a partner of Nathan Leopold, manage an action after his publicity in the crime of the century.
When investigating a cold case, particularly one that's almost 100 years old, forensic science can only go so far into opening new doors. The motives and know-how, sometimes they're lost to time.
Loeb, and presumably his partner Nathan Leopold, managed to escape and collaborate with Al Capone is certainly foreboding. If something like that were to happen today, it'd be a major threat to national security. But then again, we have to remember that the 1920s was toiled with corruption, extending even into prisons.
The cloth also revealed the remnants of fire tracks, which matched the make and in used by robbers of the Fowler Bank.
It's groundbreaking, something unthinkable today. Alas, after nearly a century of dead ends, our team has found new leads, opening new doors, but still failing to find the keys to open those that remain. Timothy Smith, behind in alcohol payments that were planned on being funneled into Capone's bootlegging business, was targeted by smaller gangs of all sizes, all of whom respected Capone, his influence, and his will. Leopold and Loeb's experience with killing teens and sociopathic tendencies seemed to be the perfect outlet for the execution for Capone, who of which been determined to assert himself and the importance of keeping up on alcohol payments. Following the assassination, the pair would have needed a quick escape, though Capone managed to move them through the underground to their shared mainstays in Chicago to Minneapolis. He would have been preoccupied with evading punishment, leading to an extended network to those experienced in escaping crime. The vehicle used to escape the robbery was still intact and made the perfect getaway. After the demise of Prohibition, organized crime continued to develop and flourish, even if its figureheads were dead or in prison. A substantial prolonged economic downturn emerged amidst the 10-year Great Depression. The opportunities provided by the liquor industry offered jobs. Its demise would be supported by presidential candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt, who would defeat Herbert Hoover on a platform of repealing prohibition, thereby popularizing opposition to the movement of alcohol restriction. In 1933, we see the 21st Amendment being ratified, repealing the 18th Amendment and bringing an end to the Prohibition era. That would be completely over by 1966, when the final remaining states prohibiting alcohol abandoned its goals of prohibition.
Great Depression, successful criminal tactics flourished through drugs, gambling, prostitution, and loan sharking, allowing organized crime to be respected as a legitimate business by many. What started as an extreme means of evading simple evasion charges led to what would today become commonplace. Even as probation ended, the whims of some of the era's most notorious gangsters would live on.